Welcome to Bits and Pieces Quilting. Today we are going to dive into our scrap bins for a really fun project, so stay tuned. Hi, I'm Michelle, and today is all about digging into our scraps to make the 4-patch trellis quilt. A couple of weeks ago, I did a video on how to select scraps for a scrappy quilt, and I hope you've seen that video. There's going to be a link to that in the description down below. So if you have not already separated and selected your scraps for this project, go take a look at that video, go get your scraps, we'll wait, come on back here, and let's make the 4-patch trellis. Before we talk about the scrap component of this project, I want to talk about the background fabric and the background squares. So you will need 82 of these background squares that are 4.5 inches square. Now in the pattern, you will see the instructions say to cut 11 strips, and from those 11 strips, you will cut the 82 that you need. You'll get 88, so you'll have 6 left over. That's based on 40 inches of fabric. But as I was cutting mine, I ended up getting 9 strips per width of fabric, meaning I had it's a little bit bigger than 40 inches. So I wanted to talk about where I ended up. Because I was able to get 9 squares out of each strip of fabric, I only needed 9 strips of fabric, which gave me 81. But unfortunately, I need 82 squares. So instead of cutting a 10th strip 4.5 inches wide, what I did was I cut a 10th strip that's 5 inches wide, because the borders on this project are going to be the inner border is going to be 2.5 inches wide. But I cannot cut 2.5 inches, two 2.5 inch borders out of a 4.5 inch width of strip. So what I'm going to do is I am going to take this 5-inch strip, I'm going to cut a 4.5 inch piece off of one end, and this is going to become square number 82 and the full number that I need for my background fabrics. And then I'm just going to cut this little 1/2 inch off so that it's 4.5 inches square. So that is waist. But with this 5-inch strip now, 5-inch wide strip minus the 4.5 inches I cut off one end, I'm going to just lay this down, fold it up, and now I'm going to cut it in half, and I have two 2.5 inch strips that will become part of the pieces that I use in my border. This is just a little bit of thinking ahead. Instead of having a 4.5 inch strip with one piece cut off the end of it that would probably just end up back in the collection somewhere, I now have pieces of my border, and other than the little 1/2 inch that I cut off, I'm not wasting anything. So just a little piece of advice there to think ahead. And despite the pattern saying that you're going to need 11 strips based on 8 per strip, I was actually able to cut mine just out of 9 strips because of that extra width of fabric. So I have a few step out pieces here to show you how to sew the trellis pieces. I will take you over to the machine in a few minutes and show you actually how I sew this seam without actually drawing the line. I'll get Jason up here to help me film that part of it. But let me walk you through what we need to do. So this is based on the sew and flip method. So I've put a 2.5 inch square on top of my 4.5 inch background, and I've sewn corner to corner. And then with just the scissors, I've just cut that piece off. But if you've watched my channel, you know that we save those pieces. So that's what I've got here. These are the pieces that get cut off, and then I sew down, I guess it's hard to see on the dark fabric, isn't it? I sew down this side so that it becomes this unit, which is half of an hourglass block. And I will square these to 2.5 inches, to 2 inches, and hopefully have a fabulous project for you before the end of the video. So with that piece cut off, I have been pressing these seams open. I'm just a little bit obsessed with pressing seams open these days. Things just seem to lay a lot flatter. And then you repeat the process and you put a second 2.5-inch square on the other side. Sew the seam diagonal corner to corner, cut off the extra, and then press it however you wish. You can press it to the dark side or press your seams open like I've done. This is it for the trellis block, and it gives you this little 1/4 inch here where your pieces overlap, so that when you sew those into the final project, you'll get perfect points on these elements. Now we have 82 alternate background blocks. You only need 72 that are sewn like this. The other 10 we just leave plain. So these are the first 2 blocks for the 4-patch trellis. The third block, as you can imagine in the title, is a 4-patch. So from your bin of scraps, and I hope that you have raided into your scrap collection and pulled out all the things that you're going to use in this project. There are a number of ways you could be making 4-patches out of things. So I'm just looking through here. You could take individual squares and lay them out and make a 4-patch. Make them nice and different. This is a scrappy project, so you want to make sure things are nice and scrappy. And just lay out your 4 pieces like this and sew a 4-patch. You could take some smaller strip pieces, so something like this perhaps, and find something that coordinates with it or doesn't, which is part of the charm of all of this. Let's see, what have we got? I don't know, maybe, here we go. Maybe something like that. Oops, it's got a bite out of it. Okay, maybe not something like that. Here we go, maybe a little bit of beige. And you could sew these 2 like this into a strip unit. Press that open and cross-cut those so you get some 2Zs. You really want to make sure things are nice and jumbled up, so I wouldn't keep this really long piece of beige and sew something else of equal length, because then you'll have a lot of instances of the same fabrics together scattered across your project. I would keep those sections nice and short, but it will speed up your piecing if you do a little bit of that strip piecing and then cross-cutting. I have a few things that I found in here in my scrap bin. That's just way too much blue. So I'm going to pull some of these apart. I might actually leave a couple of the 2Zs and pair it up with other things just to dilute the blue a little bit. But go through your scrap bin, and in the end, you're going to need 83 4-patch blocks. So I've got a lot of sewing ahead. Go off and sew your 83 4-patches, your 72 trellis units, and then with our 10 plain units, we will talk about how to put the quilt together. Over here at the machine, I want to talk about making the trellis units. And to do that, we're going to use the sew and flip method, where we put a square, this is a 2.5-inch square, on our 4.5-inch background squares. And you can draw a line corner to corner here in order to sew on that line. I could use a pencil, it might show. Because I've got a dark fabric, something more like a chalk pencil would probably work better, but I don't have one of those. So I want to talk about my preferred method, which is a little piece of painter's tape that I've stuck to my sewing machine. So I cut the piece of painter's tape, I just ripped it, used my ruler and a pen, and drew a straight line based on the edge of the tape on the piece of painter's tape. And then carefully with my ruler, lined it up so that this line is directly in line with my needle and in the center of my presser foot. I made sure that the edge of my ruler, that my ruler lined up here, lined up with this line, so everything is straight and square. And now I can just use this line to guide my piece under the machine and get a perfect corner to corner seam. So let me show you how this works. I'm just going to send this corner underneath my presser foot, just a stitch or 2 so that it's caught, and then make sure that this point is right here along this pen line that I've drawn. And I'm just going to send it through the machine, making sure that this stays along my pen line. And this way, I know that I have a very nice corner to corner seam like this. You can see it on the back here with the thread. And so this, for the sew and flip method, is how we start to build our trellis units. I will need to sew another one across this side to complete the unit, but before I go over to the machine, to the iron, and press this, I want to cut off this sew and flip unit. So I'm going to cut this just with my scissors. You could take this over to your cutting table and line up a nice 1/4 inch seam there and cut it, but I just use my scissors because it's really simple. And do not throw these away. If you watch my channel at all, you know that I really like to use these and to save these. And what I do with these pieces is I run them under the machine like this. I don't run them under the machine on the diagonal to make a little baby half square triangle. I think these are just way too small. But instead I sew them like this so that this becomes half of an hourglass unit. So save all of these. We need 72 of these squares in our project, which means we're going to get 72 complete hourglass units. And hopefully by the time I'm finished filming this video, I will have a very cool bonus project for you in order to use these up. These are the bonus units that we've cut off as a result of the sew and flip method. I have pressed these towards the dark side, and now I'm going to line these up right sides together. I'm going to nest these seams so that I have a nice tight fit in here. And then I'm just going to run these underneath the machine with a rough 1/4 inch seam. And this is going to create the hourglass unit. I will take this over to the iron and I will press this seam open. I've become a real fan of pressing seams open lately. And then I will square this block up to 2 inches square. I wanted to talk about my process for sorting out the scraps for this project. So I started by going through everything I pulled out and putting all the 2.5 inch squares into a pile. And then I went through what I had, and everything that was 4.5 inches and smaller, I cut into 2.5 inch strips, or sorry, 2.5 inch squares, and added those to the pile. Anything that was 4.5 inches, because 2.5 by 4.5 is a really standard size for a lot of quilt patterns. So that actually went into a pile and then back into the collection because those will be used in another project. And I didn't want to waste the fabric by cutting the 2.5 by 4.5 into a 2.5 inch square and wasting that 2 inch piece. So then the next step was to look at everything that was 2 inches by 5 inches, so things like this. I know that I can get 2 pieces out of something that's 2.5 by 5 inches. And so I matched those up with the strips that I had. And so circling back to the 2.5 inch squares, once I had gone through all of the pieces and pulled out everything that was 5 inches or smaller, 2.5 inch squares into one pile, 4.5 inch squares back into the collection, and then everything else into these kinds of piles. I then started to sort them by size, and so where things matched up, I laid them together as a pair to be sewn under the sewing machine. Where I had something that was a strip of fabric, I cut those into 10 inch pieces because a 10 inch piece will cross cut into 4 2.5 inch strip units. And that seemed like a nice mix of having 4 exactly the same. I didn't want to take a full 40 inch strip of fabric, sew it to another full 40 inch of fabric, and then get 16 of exactly the same pairs because I'm trying to make this really scrappy. So that's why this pile has a lot of things that are 10 inches, because that was a way to divide the strips up without any waste and then get a nice mix of colors paired together. Then I started to sew things together. So this is all of the 2.5 inch squares paired up and sewn together. You can see here I have these strips that I now need to cross cut. And I've got those divided into 2 piles here. Half of them are going here, which will become 4 patches, and half of them are going here, which will eventually become part of our scrappy border. So this is how I'm trying to make sure there's a lot of variety and make the very most of the scraps that I have. After sewing together all of those little 2 patches, I then matched up the 2 patches to create the 4 patches. And as the pattern will tell you, you need 83 4 patches for this project. So with the 4 patches done, then it came to assembling the quilt top. So I took the 73 trellis units, the 10 blank plain squares, and then laid them out according to the quilt diagram in the pattern to create the center of the quilt. Now I will say I had to continually reference the quilt diagram because I found getting the orientation of the trellis blocks, some point up, some point down, some point left, some point right, I found that a little challenging, especially because they form these little stars, which you might be able to see. But those stars in this row, for example, this one points up and then this one points down and then points up and then points down. But it was hard to intuitively lay that out without referencing the quilt diagram. So be sure to do that. Be sure to download the pattern from my website. And once you have all of your squares made, lay them out and sew them together into the center of the quilt, which we've done here. Then I added a 2.5-inch border, and that's already been added here on the top and bottom. And then the final step is to add the pieced border. But before we do that, I want to just quickly talk about why I have the number of rows that I do and why you have some of the blank squares up here. So there's a blank one there, there's a blank one down the side. I consciously wanted the trellis to end. So that's why it's 11 rows across. You need an odd number to make sure that the trellis doesn't end in a weird, without it ending in a weird, like you don't want it to end sort of there because that looks sort of incomplete. So that's why there's the 11 rows. And then you need an odd number of rows for the length as well in order to complete that image and keep the trellising all in the center of the quilt. So this is 11 by 15. You could do 13 by 17. You could do 13 by 15. So long as it's an odd number of rows, you'll get that same effect. The final step to finishing this scrappy project is to add the scrappy borders. These are so fun and an amazing way to really use up those bits and pieces. So because of the design, everything matches perfectly, meaning the 2.5-inch squares to become 4 patches are 4.5 inches. The 4.5-inch squares trellis units, these are all multiples of what you get when you sew 2.5-inch squares together. So by adding a 2.5-inch border and then using the 2.5-inch squares for the border pieces, everything lines up perfectly. So every trellis unit takes 2 units in the border. Every 4 patch takes 2 units in the border. The inner border takes 1 unit. So it all lines up perfectly all the way down the quilt, which means you don't even have to measure the length of your borders. You just need to count up the number of units that you need for the sides and then the top and bottom. So I've done that for you in the pattern as well. I need a piece that is 32 pieces long for the side borders and pieces that are 30 units long for the top and bottom. So in sewing these together, once I made those 2 patches I showed you earlier, I then added a 3rd piece to all of them to make 3 patches, to make 3 units, and then just started to sew those together. So I've got about 4 different lengths, 5 different lengths of border pieces here. I need to count them up. I might need to unpick 1 or 2 rows and stick them on other pieces just to make sure that they're the right length. But I'm going to go do that now and then add them to the quilt. So here we are outside with the final quilt, and I think it looks so good. There are a few places where some of those maybe questionable colors kind of pop out, but I think I like that overall. I've got Jason holding it up, so there's Jason hiding behind the quilt. One of the things I want to show you is something I saw on social media called the Victory Lap. And it's this tiny little bit of stitching right here along the edge because you have all of these open seams all the way along. And so I always do this when I do a piano key border or a border like this. but I had never heard it called a victory lap before, and I love that name. So do a victory lap around your quilt unless you're going to quilt it right away. But there it is. Now throughout the video, I've been promising a bonus project for the offcuts, and unfortunately I haven't got that finished yet. So that's going to be another video. So I'll hold you in suspense on the bonus project, but I hope you enjoy this trellis quilt. Thanks very much for watching this video on the 4-patch trellis. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it made a real dent into your scrap bucket. And if it didn't, well, there's lots more scrappy quilts coming up. Thanks again for watching, and don't forget to make the most of your fabric bits and pieces.